New York loses another gun carry case in federal court, plus an interview with National Review's Robert VerBruggen on the murder spike and serious problems with the FBI's crime data. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun. I had one friend.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and check out our free weekly newsletter today if you want to stay up to date on the latest in gun news from a sober, serious source that doesn't overflow your inbox. We send you one email a week, and it has all the most important gun news in America for that week. It helps you stay up to date, real easy like. And if you want more insight, you can also buy a membership and help support our reporting here at The Reload. We are 100% reader funded, and if you buy a membership, you'll get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and stories that you will not find anywhere else. You'll also get this podcast a day early and the opportunity to appear on the show like we have this week. We have a member at the end of the show doing a member segment, my favorite segment. So make sure you stay tuned for that and sign up for a membership if you want to be on the show at some point in the future. But this week, our main guest is Robert VerBruggen from National Review and the Manhattan Institute. Welcome to the show, Robert. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Can you tell people just a little bit more about yourself before we start?
Sure. Yeah. My background is in journalism. So I've been writing for various outlets, including National Review and whatnot, for a long time. About a year ago, I became a Manhattan Institute fellow. That's my main home base these days. I write for City Journal and write reports for them, and also kind of cast a broad net and try to get my analysis out through as many different outlets as I can, such as appearing on fantastic podcasts like the Reload.
Yes, the most popular podcast in the world, the Reload, the Weekly Reload Podcast. At least when it comes to gun policy, probably. Right. But speaking of which, we are going to be focusing on one of your specialties, an area that you've written about extensively over the last couple of years, and that is the gun violence statistics in the United States and sort of how they correlate to gun sales and some of the broader issues that obviously we focus on a lot here at the Reload. And I just want to start off with the FBI has released new data for 2021, and it shows a slight increase in gun murder, in murder generally, over 2020, but also they say there's significant problems with their data. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. But basically, through the year 2020, the way this works is that police departments submit their data to the FBI, which puts it together and uses it to come up with national estimates. Through the year 2020, agencies could choose between two different ways of submitting their data. One was called the summary reporting system. It was basically just a count of how many types of different crimes they dealt with over the past month. They report these on a monthly basis. The other was called the National Incident-Based Reporting System, which is a lot more detailed. It has things about every single incident, including time of day, demographics of the victim and perpetrator, and so on and so forth. It's just a lot more detailed. But about 5 years ago, they decided that they wanted to push everybody into the more sophisticated system. And so they made an announcement. They've been doing grants, basically trying to get everybody transferred over to the new system. But of course, the drop dead deadline was 2021,
yes,
which was probably not the best year to do that. And
I want to get into these issues a little bit more a little later in the show, but yeah, they've decided to make this monumental change in how they report crime statistics right at the moment that we're getting into a crime spike that's unlike anything we've seen in 30 years from all indications. And speaking of those indications, we also had the CDC numbers come out fairly recently on murder in 2021. And they showed a spike as well. The gun murder rate, the murder rate. These are different things. I want to be accurate, and I don't want to confuse anyone here. The murder rate is at a decades-long high. We're back now, it seems, according to CDC at least, or homicide rate, I should say, not murder rate, because CDC doesn't this is one of the issues I'm sure we'll talk about, but they don't determine the justification of a homicide or what kind of homicide. It's just that a homicide occurred, which is when a human kills another human being, right? And that rate is now what it was back in the 90s, which is very concerning, of course, because since the 90s, we've been at a much lower homicide rate than has traditionally been the case. So can you just talk a little bit about this, just the baseline, what we know today?
Sure. Well, I mean, what I would say is that we have at least three different ways of looking at the homicide or murder rate in the year 2021. One is this new set of FBI data that suggests that the murder rate was up about 4%, but because they have so few, about a third of the population lives in an area whose police department didn't report to the FBI this year. So that's a very uncertain estimate. They say it's not even a statistically significant difference. But that's one estimate. The CDC numbers also have it up about 5%, though. And the CDC has much more comprehensive data because what they're doing is tallying up death certificates. The difference between homicide and murder is important because if you're concerned about, for example, justifiable homicides, the CDC is going to lump those in with other homicides. But the trend lines tend to be very similar. So that also shows about a 5% increase. And you're also seeing a very similar thing out of big cities. So big cities oftentimes have more sophisticated data systems, and they publish their own data on a monthly basis even. So people track the big city numbers separately because they're more up to date. And that's also saying the same thing, which is, murder was up a little bit in 2021, even relative to 2020, which was a year that we had a massive, about roughly 30% spike in murders and homicides, which was
Right.
very bad.
So it's up, but it's not, the rate of increase is slowing, I guess, would be the sort of positive takeaway.
Yeah. Basically, I would say that the homicide rate exploded in 2020, rose up a little bit more in 2021, and by some early indications in 2022 seems to be ticking back down a little bit. But that's something we'll get better information on as the year unfolds.
Okay, that makes sense. And then let's just dive a little bit deeper into these issues with the FBI's numbers, because I think it's very significant. And I imagine you agree, because CDC is one thing, that they at least have not changed their methodology. So we have consistent data from them. But it's, as you said, it's death certificates. So it's basically a coroner's determination as to whether or not someone was, killed by another person or they committed suicide or something along those lines. And they don't get into the crime aspects of any of this. They don't make determinations on crimes. And so the FBI is the one who tracks that kind of stuff. And that's usually where you go to look at crime data in the United States and trends and this. That's where a lot of the numbers everybody's familiar with in the gun debate come from, about because they'll track weapon usage as well. And that's why we know that traditionally only about 500 rifles, which AR-15s are a subcategory of rifles. Everybody's, I'm sure, heard this talking point before, but only about 500 murders a year have been committed with rifles, and far more are committed with knives or with blunt instruments like bats, or even with, I think the FBI calls them personal weapons, right? Which is fists and feet. So that's where those sorts of stats come from. And it's really troubling, right? That the FBI has really mishandled this transition to their new reporting system, because right as we're having this incredible change in murder, at least, or in homicide, because I guess we maybe should spend a little time talking about the difference between the homicide rate increasing and what's happened with violent crime generally, because they haven't seen the same kind of increases there. But how does this happen? How does the FBI mess this up at the worst possible moment, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of basically having made this decision 5 years ago or so, and what's happened since. I mean, there's you have the pandemic, and everything that threw everybody off. And it also has to do with this. These have always been voluntary systems. So we got to a really good place with the old system where we were getting coverage from about 95% of the population. I think the number of the percentage of agencies reporting was a bit lower. It was kind of in the 80 to 90% range, but those were mostly smaller agencies that weren't reporting. But this is a voluntary system, and we were at a pretty good place with it, with the agencies having both options to report their numbers in a simpler way or report it in a more complicated way. And they just ended up picking the absolute worst time to force everybody over. And because it's a voluntary system, you have a lot of agencies aren't doing it. They don't want to bother with it. It requires a lot of manpower to switch everybody to a new system requires data in a new format, requires more information to be collected about all these crimes. You need to retrain a bunch of people. You might need to upgrade your systems. And there's money available for that, but a lot of places just haven't gotten around to it. And sometimes the problem has even been at the state level. For example, California, there are a handful of agencies in California that have submitted their data just by themselves. But the way that it normally works is that the state agency pulls together all the information and sends it to the federal government, and that's not happening in California. So you're missing almost the entirety of California, including the LAPD. The NYPD also is not reported. So this is not just a matter of some smaller agencies the way it used to be. This is some entire states are almost entirely missing data. Some huge agencies aren't doing it. It's a total mess, and we're missing about a third of the country this year.
Wow. Wow. That's even worse than I thought. California is the most populous state in the country too. So, geez. Yeah. I don't know. What does this mean? What does this imply for how we can look at this crime data now? Like, obviously there's going to be the political debate over rising homicide rates. It's one of the top issues in the midterms. It's the gun control groups are laying the problem at the feet of loose gun laws and the other side is laying it at the feet of less aggressive prosecution of crime, right? But is there a fundamental problem with even trying to judge what effects any of these policies have, given how poor the reporting for this data is now?
I think when it comes to homicide specifically, the silver lining is that homicide is one of the better counted crimes. It's tabulated by both the CDC and the FBI, so we can get a sense from the CDC data of what's happening. Even if the CDC isn't measuring exactly what we might want, the pattern is generally the same. When the FBI measure goes up, the CDC measure goes up. So yeah, I think with homicide specifically, you can turn and look at other data sources. To me, the big missing factor is all these other crimes that they're trying to tabulate, assaults, rapes, theft, all a whole bunch of violent property crimes. We just have no idea what happened in 2021 because we don't have a national source on it anymore. It's all, if you look at their report, it's the gist of it seems to be that changes seem to have been pretty small between 2020 and 2021, but the confidence intervals they have are just so wide because they're just missing so much data. They just don't know what happened.
Wow. Yeah. That's pretty significant. This conclusion that I mentioned earlier, that violent crime is actually not increasing the same level that murder has increased. Is that viable, or is that a problem given the reporting? I would be hesitant to conclude that just based on the FBI report because it's frankly trash. It's very bad. But if you combine what we've seen out of individual police departments, if you also look at there's another recent data release from the Department of Justice sort of statistical machinery called the National Crime Victimization Survey. It's where they survey basically a cross section of the public, a representative sample, and ask them what their experiences were with crime. That can also give you a sense of these trends, and that seems fairly consistent across different measures. Is that first of all, in 2020, other violent crimes and property crimes did not rise the way that homicide did. In some cases, it even fell. Especially in 2020, thanks to all the lockdowns and things. And they've been much more steady since. But we don't have nearly as good of data as we would have had if the 2021 data had been collected the way that the 2020 numbers were. And then obviously, one of the main arguments that you'll hear in regards to crime data and firearms the last several years now deals with the correlation between the increasing homicide rate and the increasing number of gun sales in the United States and And the argument is that those two things are not just correlated, but also that one is causing the other. In particular, that gun sales increasing led to homicides increasing. You've written about this. I've written about it as well, but I want to hear a little more from you on what you make of this argument. Is there any validity to it? And if not, why not?
The way I put it in a piece I wrote for National Review about a year ago now, is that there's sort of a paradox here, because there are two different ways of drilling into that correlation. One is to look geographically, and you can say, look, we had this huge surge in gun sales, but different states had surges in gun sales to different degrees. Is there a correlation there? Did the places that saw the biggest spikes in homicide also have the biggest spikes in gun sales? And the answer to that question is no. If you plot the data, those numbers against each other, there's just nothing there. There's no geographic correlation there. But another good data source that helps us get at that question is the ATF's gun trace data. Unfortunately, those aren't broken down as finely as we would like them to be, but you can see in those numbers what percentage of guns that were traced by police departments had been purchased recently. And those numbers, in fact, shot up at the same time. So it seems that newer guns are being more likely to be traced by police departments, but it does not appear that the places where the guns are being sold are the places where they're seeing homicide spikes. So I came up with what I think is a sort of a reasonable theory to reconcile those two things, which is that you actually had two different things going on there. One is that you have the pandemic and the riots, and that causes a lot of people to be scared and they run out and buy guns. These are legal gun purchases. Overwhelmingly, they don't really have anything to do with crime. They're by law-abiding people who are passing background checks. But at the same time, you have this dramatic surge in violence. And when there's a surge in violence like that, you're going to have criminals being more likely to search out guns. And one way they search out guns is by trafficking them. So that there's going to be a surge in newly bought guns that are showing up at crimes, but it isn't necessarily part of the same phenomenon as just sort of this generalized surge in gun buying.
Yeah. No, I think that's interesting. Sort of explanation for both of those pieces of data, because you're right that the trace data is interesting in that it does show there was some increase in how quickly a gun went from a sale to what the ATF calls time to crime, which is how quickly it went from being sold to being recovered at a crime scene. Although, like you said, there's any breakdown on what kind of crime scene it was, or why the ATF recovered it, anything like that. So it's not really granular in the way that like the FBI's crime data is supposed to be. But I thought that the sort of an inherent flaw in this, to me, there were 2 points that matter quite a lot, which is that the reason we know that gun sales increased is because the way you track that is through, as you briefly mentioned there, the number of FBI background checks that were conducted through the National Criminal Background Check System. And which means that in order to obtain the gun in the first place, you have to not have a criminal record. Now, obviously, as you pointed out, you can use straw purchasers, basically people who don't have criminal records but are buying guns for people with criminal records, intentionally doing that. You can still have some percentage of those people who pass the background check where their gun ultimately ends up in a crime quickly because of trafficking. But you still have time to crime at, I believe it was 8 years last time I looked. It might be slightly less than that now, but I don't think the time has come down on average very much. The median time to crime is not, has not significantly dropped over these last 2 years, as you would expect if all of the new gun sales were going straight into committing homicides.
Yeah.
So I think there's a number of issues with this concept that because gun sales rose at the same time that homicides rose, that the gun sales must be causing the homicides. And in fact, and I think you've written about this a little bit, it may well be the other way around.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's one thing. as a gun owner, I'm sure, and I'm sure you've heard it from plenty of other people. One of the biggest reasons people name for buying a gun is that they're looking to defend themselves. And when you have rising crime, when you have rising homicide rates, and you have just generally scary things happening like the pandemics and the riots of 2020, you want to protect yourself. So that's an obvious driver of the gun sale spike. So it's very difficult to sort out statistically, which direction the causation runs sometimes.
Yeah, and I would say too that in 2020, the largest relative increase in monthly gun sales, as judged through NICS checks, was actually in June, not in March. March 2020 had the most gun related background checks in history, and that's obviously when the onset of the pandemic and the lockdowns occurred. But June 2020 had a larger relative increase from a normal June, because June is the summer months. Gun sales are cyclical, so they go. There's a certain cycle. They pick up in the fall. Usually, Black Friday is the largest gun sales day of the year, traditionally, and then there's hunting season starts at that time as well, and then they move through the winter and spring, and they're relatively strong times. And spring's pretty strong because that's the model year end, so there's more bargains generally, and then it tapers off in summer. But in June of 2020, there was a huge spike in sales that was also happened to be around the time that we saw that George Floyd was murdered, and then there were protests, which of course oftentimes ended in rioting that spread across the country. So there seems like a fairly obvious at least correlation. I guess you'd have to do a little more to prove causation, just like the other way around.
Yeah, so sometimes common sense, I think, gets you pretty far, as in that case. Right. Yeah.
Whereas there's a number of common sense reasons to think that the gun sales spike is not the catalyst for the gun murder or the homicide rate spike. Because again, the people who were buying those guns were passing background checks to do it. That's how we know there was a spike. There may have been a spike. There probably was, as you mentioned, a spike in criminal gun sales as well, like the number of illegal sales to people who can't own guns. But that would be something that's not tracked necessarily by the number of NICS checks done.
Right.
Because, that's criminals don't go into gun stores to buy guns because they won't be able to actually pass the background check. But they'll go to, the person that they know who has guns and is willing to sell them to them or give them. I mean, oftentimes gangs will use, it's almost like a gun library. They pass the guns around between each other to whoever needs them at whatever moment. So, and obviously criminal, as you sort of alluded to there, a lot of the criminal motivations for carrying guns are not just to commit criminal acts, robberies or what have you, but oftentimes criminals carry the guns for the same reasons that anyone else would carry them, which is self-defense. They feel that they are in danger and they want to carry guns even if they're not allowed to under law. And so, they'll at times where violence spikes, it wouldn't be a surprising thing to find that criminals tend to arm themselves more often, on a more regular basis at those times, right?
Yeah, I think that's basically the gist of my theory. Is that you have two different things going on. You have people lawfully trying to arm themselves because the world has gotten really scary, and then you also have criminals trying to arm themselves because the world has gotten really scary. And they're two different phenomena to a large extent, because in one case you have people going in and buying the guns and passing background checks, and in the other case you have criminals trying to procure guns kind of whatever way they can. And sometimes those are going to overlap, where the criminals get newer guns because they were able to steal a gun that had just been purchased, or there's a straw purchasing situation or what have you. But I think that's a way of reconciling these two facts, where there doesn't seem to be a geographical link between the gun sales and the homicide spike, but there does seem to be this surge of recently purchased guns being traced by the police. So.
Yeah, and I would also. I wonder about your. I want to get your thoughts on this. Obviously, during that lull in the homicide rate in the United States. We used to have very high homicide rates in the 80s and 90s. And they came down in the early 2000s, and they've stayed relatively low up until just recently here. And during that period, especially, the Obama administration, right? The gun sales picked up dramatically from 2008 to 2016, especially after the Sandy Hook shooting in 2013, or when people were concerned that there would be new restrictions on gun ownership. There was a huge spike in gun sales, but we didn't see a corresponding spike in the homicide rate at that point. What do you make of that? Like, is that further evidence that there isn't really a causal link between gun sales through the background check system and the homicide rate generally?
I mean, at minimum, I would say it shows that it's very complicated. I think a lot of people who are very fervent gun control activists see it as a sort of one-step solution to our murder problem. But there's just very clearly not a one-to-one relationship between, gun control laws or gun sales and homicide. Over the 1990s, a lot of states were liberalizing their concealed carry laws. That was the biggest drop in homicide I think we've ever seen. There was a continued lull through the 2010s as well, as gun ownership was rising. And
going off of that, actually, you'll see some gun rights advocates argue the opposite direction, right? Like you mentioned there was a liberalization of gun carry laws at the very least in the 90s through the 2000s, and a similar time period that we saw a decrease in the homicide rate. Is that enough evidence to conclude that there's a causal relationship there too, or how do you view these things?
I mean, I would say no. And I'm actually working on a report right now that goes through some of the concealed carry literature. So I've been looking at this pretty closely. But the states that never implemented concealed carry at all saw some of the biggest drops that anybody saw over that period.
And what do you mean? What do you mean by never implemented?
Well, basically what I did for my report is I sorted out states based on when they implemented concealed carry with the states that never implemented it through Brune.
I mean, like may issue states, so like New York,
may issue states, so on and so forth.
Okay,
but they saw as big a drops as anybody saw. I don't think there's any clear relationship between implementing concealed carry and seeing especially big drops in homicide. Mm-hmm. So when you start the data out that way, I think it's more of just sort of a null result. There doesn't seem to be a big effect in either direction.
Okay. So going off of that, I wonder what is there in the data that we can look at to understand this recent spike in homicide? Like what, is it caused by the pandemic, the lockdowns, the mental stress, the financial distress of the markets crashing at least for a while? And is there anything that we can look at now, if it's not the gun sales surge, if it's not related to that, what's a better place to look for causation?
Yeah, I actually had a report with my colleague Christos Makridis earlier this year. It's called Breaking Down the 2020 Homicide Spike. And we looked at a bunch of different variables. One sort of distressing thing is that homicide basically rose for everybody. And it especially targeted groups and places where homicide rates were already high. So, for example, if you look at it, you break it down by race, blacks saw a much bigger increase than whites did in raw terms. And similarly for
Native Americans as well, right?
Yeah. And large central city areas, very urban areas saw a bigger increase as well because they already had a higher increase. So basically, if the homicide rate increases 30% for everybody, but you were starting out with a much higher homicide rate, even if you have the same 30% increase, that's going to be way bigger. So that was the distressing thing about it. But one interesting thing in terms of causes, though, is the timeline of it. If you look at the 2020 month-by-month tallies from the CDC of homicides, the year actually didn't get off to a great start to begin with. Even January and February were a little bit higher than the previous average. But it starts to go up a little bit after the pandemic, and then it really explodes in the summer. I think the key incident was the George Floyd murder and the resulting protests and riots. I think it had a really profoundly demoralizing impact on police in urban areas, and I think it was very bad for those areas.
So it's so you're more partial to this idea that of like a police pullback, that after the protests and the riots, police were less inclined to take risks enforcing the law or what have you, and perhaps that resulted in more lawlessness, I guess.
Yeah. I think it's a dynamic process where you have people who are, first of all, legitimately angry about what happened to George Floyd. There's a lot of anger that spills over there. And then, it spills over into riots, and the police aren't able to control the riots. So I think these twin effects of sort of emboldening criminals and while cowing the police because they don't want to be they don't want to see themselves as in a viral video, for example. And I think that's been a very consistent pattern. Roland Fryer and Tanaya Devi had a really interesting study a couple years back looking at a lot of cities that had viral incidents like that. And it's a very consistent pattern that when you have one of those viral incidents, police pull back and crime goes way up. It's a
right. Don't they call that the Ferguson effect or something like that?
Yeah, that was that's a term that goes back about 5 years. It was popularized by my colleague Heather McDonald, but I think it was a Missouri police chief who used it initially.
So that's to you that there's more evidence in the data for that sort of effect than there is for gun sales or even but I guess one critique of that I've heard that I'm interested in your take on is that the violence or the homicide rate increased everywhere. It's not just in those big cities, right? Although, as you noted, the 30% increase when you've already got 200 murders a year is going to be much larger than if you only have a couple murders a year. But why is this effect happening in places that, for instance, don't have progressive prosecutors or that never bought into the idea of the defund the police movement or something like along those lines? Like, why is this having an effect there?
Yeah, that's a totally fair point. I don't think it's a 100% total explanation, but I think it goes a long way to explaining a lot of what happened, especially in the bigger cities that saw enormous increases.
And so what? I don't know. Do you have any policy suggestions as possible solutions? For this, if it's not a gun sales related problem, and if it's not even necessarily a soft on crime prosecutor problem, it's more of this sort of cultural issue of police being more concerned about public image, I guess is one way to put it. What's the solution to something like that?
Well, I think part of the solution is, prosecution policy and things like that, making sure that you're incapacitating people who've, been violent repeatedly. I think that's very important. I wouldn't downplay that. I also had a different report about a year or so ago now, I think, called Depolicing and What to Do About It, where I tried to take on that question. And the bottom line is that it's extremely difficult. You can't force police to be active when they don't want to be, because it's so much of their job is subjective. Like if they get a call and they have to go to a certain place to deal with a crime, they'll do that. But it's very hard. Quotas are just outright illegal in most places. They're heavily frowned upon. Police don't like them. The public doesn't like them. You can't
for good reason.
Yeah, you can't tell people you have to make so many arrests or stops or whatever each year. Some of the things I hit on is I think it is important to. It's important to hold police accountable, but it's also important to support good police and assure police that they're going to be treated fairly if something happens. I think that we could do a lot more in that regard. I think some of the statements by public officials basically tearing down the cops as soon as something happens without waiting to find out what happened first, I think were really bad. Avoiding things like that is important. But yeah, you're right that it's that specific problem is very difficult to solve, and even solving that problem, I don't think would address everything because, as you mentioned, homicide is up everywhere. It's not just the areas that have, really strong defund the police movements. It's really kind of taken hold across the country now.
Yeah. I think that's a good answer, honestly, because it's just these are not simple problems, and they're not going to have simple solutions. I'd expect. And that's where, I always am extremely skeptical of people who want to tell me that there's a very easy solution to some major societal problem. because I doubt it's true. I mean, it seems like there is that we had come up with a with a better approach to this, given the results of the last 30 years. But how we get back to that point is another question. We have to, even figuring out exactly what went wrong. I think it's going to take a little while to do. And I think what you've said is there's a lot of sense in it. But of course there's a lot to this issue for sure. And so, what are you expecting to see? I mean, moving forward now, you said that 2022 thus far, the major city data we've seen, there's a decrease in the homicides.
Yeah.
But not a massive one, right? We're not getting back down to the levels we had been at, are we?
No, we're not back to 2019 levels. I would certainly hope that we see at least a gradual decline back toward where we were. But the thing is, as you mentioned, there's this huge decline in the 1990s, kind of stagnation, a little bit further decline in the 2010s. And then, in 2015, with Ferguson and everything, we saw homicide rates tick back up. And then in 2020, we had them really, really rise again. I'm just hoping we don't see something like that again, because it seems like every few years we have these sorts of issues, especially with the viral policing videos that go nationwide and really seem to wreak havoc on murder rates, which is terrible for everybody. So,
yeah, I mean, I guess it seems like there's a societal push and pull when it comes to crime and policing. I mean, I guess it's always been there, but perhaps we're with the rise of viral videos of poor police conduct, coupled with a lot of false allegations of bad policing. That we've seen that happen a number. I mean, Kenosha is probably a good example of that, where the incident that sparked those riots. I think a lot of people would say it was not an example, not a good example of bad policing, at least, given the circumstances and it was a domestic violence call where the suspect who was shot was reaching for a knife at the time that he was shot. But it got even Ferguson itself would be another highly questionable one at the very least. There's not video evidence of that, but there was a whole narrative about. Brown's hands being up when he was shot, that turned out not to be accurate, and drove a lot of the anger surrounding that one. But of course, at the same time, the George Floyd, there's no good defense of that that I've ever seen anyone make. And that, watching the video for yourself, it's very clear. And obviously that's coupled with a long history of poor treatment of minorities by police in American cities. I mean, it's not, these are legitimate problems. There's sort of a push-pull that goes on in society between like what's acceptable and what's not. And I guess we're still leveling back out to it's hard to even articulate this. Like, there's a reaction, maybe there's an overreaction, and then it comes back to a more reasonable point as far as how police are expected to perform their jobs. And then something negative happens, and then there's an overreaction and then a retraction. I don't know. That seems to be the pattern that you're alluding to there, right?
Yeah, I think that's about right. Yeah, it's so frustrating that you can have a totally legitimate protest about something that was completely bad, and you can have the same reaction sometimes to you mentioned situations where cops behaved appropriately, but whoever's, maybe it's not clear in the video, or there isn't a video, and the narrative gets started, and you can have the same sort of societal wide problems out of it.
So I guess it's hard when you have so little trust between a community and its police.
Yeah.
Right. And where there's just a sort of an assumption that there's that what was done was not acceptable. And that's based on perhaps, lived experience that's, justifies a lack of trust in some neighborhoods, in some cases. Right. But but at the same time, a lot of polling indicates that minority neighborhoods and cities don't necessarily want a pullback of policing. They want good policing. And so it's hard because, what is, I just think it's, like you said, it's a complicated problem that isn't an easy solution to. Like, everybody wants competent policing, but not everyone agrees on exactly what that means, even if we can agree on the extreme examples of it, what it doesn't mean, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It sounds like you think the decline's going to continue. Is that your impression, or do you I just wonder if we've reached a new level, like where it's going to remain this high for a while until something changes? I don't know.
Yeah, possibly naively, I'm encouraged by the decline thus far in what little data we have from 2022. So don't bookmark this conversation and call me on it in 2 years. But yeah, I'm
hopefully
hopeful.
You're right. Yeah, I hope that you're right. I would like to believe that this isn't an anomalous situation, right? That we're not going to start seeing the homicide rates as high as they were in the early to mid 90s. But obviously we have to have a lot more data on that and reliable data, which unfortunately we're not really getting, before we can make that conclusion. So we'll have to keep following your writing, I guess, is the bottom line.
Yeah.
So where can people do that?
I'm a regular contributor to City Journal, which is the Manhattan Institute's publication. I still write for National Review here and there. And I have a Manhattan Institute page that compiles all my writing from different sources. So
wonderful. And National Review, right?
Yep.
You're over at the Corner?
I'm a contributing editor there. So yeah, I write for the Corner every once in a while and contribute pieces and so on and so forth.
And you're on Twitter as well, correct?
Oh, of course I'm on Twitter.
Where can people follow you on Twitter? Because I follow you.
Well, it's RA VerBruggen is my handle. So RAVERBRUGGEN.
Awesome. Well, hopefully when we have a little more insight into the situation, more data, in the future, we'll have you back on the show and talk about it again.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined as always by Reload founder Steve Gutowski. How are you, Steve?
I'm doing good. Jake, how you doing?
Doing pretty good. Big
are
news.
You, though? After last night?
We don't have to talk about my Broncos. Everyone saw how pathetic that performance was.
Yeah, I'm an Eagles fan. I'm just not doing good after watching that last night. So
You're used to watching high quality football. That's why.
Oh my gosh, that was, boy. Those warnings of the President Biden gave of Armageddon. Initially, I was very concerned. But then I watched that game and I was like, all right, it's fine.
Sweet relief.
Bring on the global thermonuclear war.
Yeah, we're feeling that too.
To live anymore after watching a full game and overtime of that, whatever that was.
A kicker battle. But anyways, you had a big story this week, a huge court ruling in federal court on New York's Bruin response bill. If you want to tell us what happened with that decision. Yeah,
well, New York told the federal courts, thank you, sir, may I have another, and they got their second serving here. The federal district judge Sotheby issued a temporary restraining order against nearly all of the controversial portions of the new gun carry regime that the state passed earlier this year in response to Bruin. And it's all the stuff that you kind of would expect to be blocked. The Times Square ban, they created a whole section of the city that they considered Times Square, even blocks and blocks away from what everyone would consider to be Times Square, and made that off limits. He blocked that. He blocked, he basically gutted the good moral character clause, which allowed a lot of subjective inference by the permitting officials on whether or not somebody has a good moral character. He basically said you can't enforce this unless you make it into an objective standard, and you have to use the preponderance of evidence. And he added a bunch of preconditions to that. He blocked the requirement that applicants submit their social media history, and said that that's not historically grounded. He's using the Bruin standard, so he's going through and doing historical analysis of all these regulations, trying to find analogies back in the founding era, and for the vast majority of them, he couldn't find any, of course, because they didn't exist. Interestingly, this judge is fascinating to me and how he's handled this whole case. This is the same judge, right? And you wrote about this back when it happened initially, but he dismissed the first attempt at this case on the grounds that the plaintiffs didn't have standing. But he went through and basically litigated the case anyway on the merits, and told the plaintiffs how they could get standing, basically, right? And so then they did that, and now he's blocked this law, and he's gone through here in this decision and done all of the research to try and find historical analogs for these laws or these provisions, because New York refused to do that, apparently.
Yeah. Yeah. He even includes that in the opinion. He talks about, I noticed that the defendants didn't bother doing any of the briefing to do historical analogs, but I'm going to do it for you here.
Right. It's, I don't know. Well, I don't think I've ever seen a judge do a case like this. I'm not a lawyer, so, keep that in mind, but I've followed a lot of federal cases, and I've never seen one quite like this, with how the judge Sotheby has performed in this case, because he's kind of like giving advice to both sides of this issue and trying to do their work for them almost, in some ways. In fact, even at some points, he literally rewrites the law. He's if you can't enforce this provision unless you include, for instance, churches. There was a total ban on having carrying a gun into a church anywhere in the state, and he said that's doesn't comport with the Constitution unless you add an exception for people who are duty bound to protect the church. So, like, if you have somebody who's appointed your congregation's security guard or something, they can carry a gun, or if they live at the church on premises. So I guess the pastor, in some circumstances, they can carry a gun. And so he's literally changing the way these laws are written. And then at one point he blocks one of the provisions and then writes out literally in the opinion how they should rewrite it to be in compliance with the Bruin ruling. So it's pretty fascinating. But he blocks enforcement of, temporarily, at least, as a temporary restraining order that's issued, the vast majority of the controversial opinions, including the provision where they tried to flip on its head private property rules. So New York had tried to make it a crime to carry a gun on any private property, including businesses, public businesses, unless that business posted a sign saying that guns were allowed. And the judge found that this was, there was no historical analog to a regulation like this, and that it also dealt with issues of compelled speech. And, it was taking the decision out of the hands of the businesses, since they'd already been able to bar people from carrying on their property if they had wanted to. And so he blocked that provision, which was a significant one. This one we talked to Professor Robert Leiter at George Mason University. That was one of his big concerns. So that got blocked. A lot of the permitting requirements, requiring people to give list their family members that live with them for some reason, and requiring them to have in-person meetings with the permitting authorities. All these things got struck down in the ruling, as well as the vast majority of the controversial gun-free zones that were put up. Right. So they didn't strike down the entire law or block the enforcement of the entire law. he's still allowed, reference requirements for the application process. He's still allowing, the gun bans at permitted events run by the government. So, parades and things like that, or protests was another one. That's probably one of the more controversial ones that actually was allowed to stand, is a ban on carrying at protests altogether. So, but carrying where the alcohol is served, that got blocked, that's actually an interesting one, because a lot of states have that provision or something pretty similar to it.
Right.
Some states will do it only for bars, where the majority of revenue comes from alcohol sales or something like that. But he found there was no historical analog for regulation like that. So that could have further reaching implications beyond just New York and some of these copycat laws that are being considered in California and elsewhere. But a pretty significant ruling, right? And you wrote an analysis on what exactly it means, right?
Right.
In the immediate future here.
Yeah. So he, as you said, he did put a block on this law, but he actually stayed that block for 3 days to give basically New York officials a chance to decide if they want to appeal or not.
Right.
And
That's
sure
important
enough,
to note.
Sure enough, before the end of the day, they filed an appeal with the Second Circuit. So as of right now, all of the law is still in effect because the block hasn't taken effect yet. So we'll have to see what the Second Circuit does, whether or not they accept the appeal, and then once they do, how they're going to handle the restraining order. So that's important to note. This is kind of one of the sad realities, I guess, if you're a gun rights advocate, is that even though you got this good ruling, it might not actually have a practical effect immediate, in the near future or ever, depending on what the Second Circuit actually does. Now, I would imagine that if the Second Circuit reverses his ruling, that gives Gun Owners of America and the other plaintiffs in this case a sort of clear path back to the Supreme Court, which I would imagine is going to be more willing to take a case like this on a expedited basis, given that the law is just as he keeps going. You read this ruling, and he keeps going through it, and it's like basically saying, "Did you even read Bruen?" He keeps citing Bruen over and over again. Like, look, they said this stuff. It's not. Why did you do that? Right.
This is obviously not going to stand. And so I would guess the Supreme Court would want to act on a law like this.
Right. And that, I think, is one of the bigger portions, regardless of what happens with the TRO, between this ruling and then his previous one where he ended up dismissing the suit, but he still did pretty much a full analysis of the law anyway, are two of the most thorough post-Bruen legal analyses that we've seen. Some of the other TROs that we've covered in the past, like the assault weapons bans in Colorado cities, very short. There's a couple pages basically saying, I don't think this comports, and we'll just kick it and we'll see what happens as further proceedings take place. Whereas Judge Sotheby here, these are 50 plus page TROs where he's going step by step by step, applying how he sees Bruen applying, which I think is going to be crucial because, we're still in the very nascent stages of the post-Bruen world of Second Amendment litigation. So there's not a ton to go off of just yet. So the more federal courts there are that are applying this stuff, the more you get a body of case law for future litigation. I think that's where this is the biggest impact of this will come.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Bruen is still in its infancy, essentially, as a standard for how to decide these cases. And now Sotheby's his ruling is going to be one of the very first to dive into the type of historical analysis that the court is looking for, the Supreme Court is looking for. And so I think that makes it pretty influential. That's my guess as to how this is going to turn. It's probably going to be, as you wrote in your piece, a pretty influential piece of case law, because there's just not a lot of other examples of judges doing this work, and we've seen a little bit of it in Texas, right, with the felon indictment ban being struck down by a federal judge there. But he did some of the historical analysis. This one deals with a much broader look. You know, he's looking at all sorts of different prohibitions on gun carry in here and trying to, and honestly giving it his best shot at finding on his own without help from defense, which really he doesn't need to do. Right? This is the other thing about his ruling that's pretty interesting is like New York didn't present him any of the historical evidence that he actually relies on in his ruling. He went out and did all this research on his own. And, New York wanted more time to consult with historians and so forth, and decided not to even make a case based on Bruen, which has been really common, actually, for these federal cases so far. A lot of the government attorneys just have not defended these laws under the Bruen standard in any sort of substantial way. We haven't seen any coherent argument about why most of these regulations are permissible under this new standard. It's like they're trying to ignore the new standard almost, which has not worked so far, clearly. You have two federal judge rulings that have upheld gun laws under the new Bruen standard, very limited rulings. And then you have 5 or 6 now that have blocked laws under the same reasoning. And in all of those cases, outside of pointing to surety laws in the San Jose insurance case and the felon indictment cases, there hasn't really been any attempt to do the historical analysis that's required under Bruen from the defense. So this judge went out of his way to do it for them, basically. He did all the research himself from what he says, and he came up with, at least some reasonable historical analogs to some of these restrictions that exist. Like, he went out and found laws from the era. Now, most of the regulations and laws that he cites are from, the late 19th century that are right on the cusp of that sort of 14th Amendment era that the Supreme Court talks about with the Bruen test. You're supposed to be somewhere between the founding era and the era of the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment is what they use to incorporate the Second Amendment to protections to the states, because we're talking about the federal Constitution here, right? But so he's actually able to find some regulations that do mirror some of the less controversial, at least, portions of the New York law. He doesn't do a full historical analysis of everything. There are a couple sections like school, banning guns at schools and government buildings, courthouses, where he just relies on dicta from Heller and Bruen that say, well, this is presumptively okay. He doesn't try to do the historical analysis for those. He just kind of skips over them because the Supreme Court already said they were comfortable with it. But he does for the rest of them. He goes through, and if he can't find his own historical backing, he blocks the law, and if he can, but it's not a perfect fit, he kind of modifies the law in a couple of cases, or at least modifies enforcement of it. I guess his thought seemed to be like, well, if there is a way to constitutionally enforce this provision, you can do it that way, but only that way. Is sort of what he was ordering them to do. But so it's been interesting to watch the early back and forth, and how the government side has really not put up much of a fight, but a lot of judges have kind of gone out of their way to do the work on their own. Anyway, it seems to me he could have just blocked everything because the state just refused to even give him anything to go off of, but he decided not to, and decided to do his own historical inquiry, which produced pretty good results if you're a gun rights advocate. But again, as you noted, we're still going to have to wait and see what the Second Circuit actually does with this case. I think we'll have certainly a lot more of this over at the Reload in the coming days and weeks, where we look, where we track this case and look a little bit closer at this decision and how important it is. But that's it for this week's news update. We're going to head over to my favorite segment now, the member interview. All right, it's time for my favorite segment that we do here on the podcast, a member segment. We have Alan from New York City, who's a Reload member, joining us today. How are you doing, Alan?
I'm doing fine. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for reaching out to come on. Just a reminder, everyone, if you're a member of the Reload, you have the opportunity to come on and do one of these segments on the podcast if you want. It's just a little personal interview, try to get to know our members better, try to get to know the people who make the Reload possible, literally, because that's our one source of funding is membership. So, speaking of which, what's your background with guns, Alan? How did you start? Do you own any guns?
Yes. It took me about 14 months to get my long gun permit in New York City. So I finally purchased my Beretta 1301 tactical in Marine two-tone, actually. So I got to shoot it at a shotgun class earlier last month.
That's a nice gun. That's a nice shotgun.
For first,
how do you like it?
It is wonderful. I love shooting it, and I think in my shotgun class, we were 7 of the 8 of us were running 1301s of various types. The only one gentleman who didn't have one had an old Benelli pump from like the 80s, and he was very jealous of us. So
nice. So do you use that for like range shooting or home defense? What was your idea in getting that Beretta?
Well, I think the general idea was it would be very versatile. Like originally, what pushed me into getting my permit finally was like, I think in 2021, I think it was right after the Atlanta spa shootings with the anti-Asian animus stuff. But then obviously over the course of the 14 months of waiting, the fear kind of dissipated because it's like, well, yeah, I couldn't have anything for 14 months. So now it's definitely more of a back to a marksmanship sport shooting interest now. I think I've always been fairly interested in guns. I think it's just part of living in America. You get all that cultural osmosis and all that. Sure. Except that if you live in New York City, you just don't get to be part of that until like
it's much harder.
Yeah.
So you're a relatively new gun owner then,
right? This year, but I've like shot firearms on and off like at various stages of my life. Which is the irony is, I think I shot my first 22 in China at a police range. I don't even think I was supposed to be there, but I think with all the early 2000s corruption, I don't know, who knows. But whatever my dad did, we got in, right? Or it's just legal to do that. I have no idea.
And so, how long have you lived in the U.S.? When did you move here, and when did you move to New York?
I moved here when I was 3 years old. But my parents were citizens when they gave birth, so I'm still technically native born. But I've been living in New York City for like basically my entire life ever since I moved here, with the exception of 2 years in Jersey City because of rent. It's much more affordable to move out to Jersey City for a while.
I bet.
And I had considered getting a Jersey FID at the time, but I was like, if I'm moving back, it's going to take like months just to get a New York City permit. It's not going to, why bother with a Jersey City one? Because at the time, Jersey City was also running the same extra requirements on top of the state police requirements. That I noticed before, like I think JRPC did something and forced them all into compliance. But it's all a little annoying to say the least.
Yeah. No, it's interesting to have somebody on from that, this part of the country, New York, New Jersey, where gun ownership is much more difficult than most of the rest of the country, right? In Virginia, where I live, or Pennsylvania, where I was originally from, you can, as long as you don't have a record, a criminal record that disqualifies you or a mental health record that disqualifies you, you can go into a gun store and buy even a handgun the same day, as long as you pass that background check. There's no waiting periods or a bunch of extra hoops to jump through. Whereas, across the border in New York or New Jersey from Pennsylvania, at least, the process is pretty draconian, really. I mean, like you said, it took you 14 months just to get a shotgun.
Yes.
not even a handgun.
Yes. And the funniest part is when I was doing my NJ FID just to be able to shoot alone at ranges, just to get some handgun practice in, because you can't shoot handguns even without I think New York permit regardless in New York. So I was like 35 days. This is like remarkable. It's wonderful. I don't even have to go into the police precinct to get my fingerprint. I could just get my fingerprints done and I didn't go anywhere. So it was like very surprising at how every other jurisdiction is better than New York. At least the way I see it, right? Even though some people don't think.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, for instance, coming from a more typical form of gun regulation in Pennsylvania, Virginia, when I tried to get my DC carry permit initially, back when they were still May issue, the process of having to go into the police station and, fill out registration forms and have your fingerprints taken, it felt very much like being treated as a criminal, frankly. I know it's not like having your fingerprints taken for concealed carry licenses is not completely out of the ordinary. I think Florida does it as well.
Connecticut.
If you've never been through that process, it really feels like like a criminal process. I mean, I think the other people getting their fingerprints taken, at least from the attitude of the person who was doing the fingerprinting when I was in there, they probably were some sort of criminals.
Right.
So it's interesting that difference in culture around how these things are regulated and how they're treated. And I wonder too, like, how has your perspective changed since you went through that whole process? Has it changed at all? What impacted going through 14 months to get a shotgun, have on you?
Oh, it's very annoying to say the least. And you almost see there is always a partial logical basis for some of this stuff. I'm not to justify it, but it's like, oh, you need a safeguard person to call the cops if you're incapacitated or died, right? So, which forms like a social proof, right? If you can't get someone just to do that, it's like, okay, you could be a little off. I think that was the original motivation about it, instead of actually diving into your background. Because honestly, the closest analogy to New York City's regime is probably Canada. Like, you got 5-round long gun mag limits, 10-round handgun limits like the rest of the state, but also like Canada. Pretty much almost before Bruin, it was just premise only. So basically, like Canada, you're transported to the range and back. Except we were allowed home defense, right? Unlike Canada. But it really has made me skeptical of overly harsh regulations. So obviously,
yeah, I mean, because you said at the beginning here that your initial reason for wanting to buy this gun was the rash of anti-Asian hate crimes that occurred in 2021, right? When you first went to purchase,
right?
And it took 14 months before you could actually obtain the thing that you were trying to get to protect yourself from that situation, right? And even then, it's a shotgun. You can't carry it with you. It'd be even harder to get a pistol, in New York, and even harder still to get a permit before Bruin. And now after Bruin, they've tried to make it so that it's effectively impossible to carry it anywhere legally. Right. I don't know. Like, does that? How's going through that process?
It's really mixed, because I think this is something that probably was informed by just growing up in New York City. I feel I have taken a very a half European standard of like, oh, guns are a very fun hobby, fun sports shooting thing. So I could empathize with Americans who feel like, oh, this is my constitutional rights. I need this immediately. But as you can see, 14 months later, nothing has happened, right? I like the original impetus to do it was probably just like in the moment, you're like, oh man, I feel like I need something. But in the end, I didn't. I also live in a fairly safe area of New York and lived 30 years of my life without really facing any real, street crime. Which lucky for me, right? Obviously, there are those in New York who aren't as privileged. So I can understand why they would want to carry. It's sort of.
Well, do
it's
you
like,
feel like you feel like maybe you were? I mean, do you feel like you weren't right in one, like that? The concern was overdone in your mind when you went to buy the gun, or
I feel like the original concern could have been like not 100% rational, right? It would be like, statistically, top floor apartment, right? Who's really gonna do that, right? But I think there are those in less privileged positions than myself, then they probably have much greater public safety, private safety concerns than I do, right? So now I'm now primarily interested in, hey, this is a really fun hobby. You get to meet people. This shooting is obviously very fun. I think everyone could, in this hobby can agree. So it's like I obviously hate having to go through this, right? But it's also like, am I? And I
guess for you, it's you aren't living in that sort of day-to-day danger,
right?
Or you don't feel like you are,
right?
But I imagine going through that process for people who actually maybe are more exposed to criminal activity than the neighborhood that you're in or what have you. Do you feel that the process makes sense for them?
It doesn't. No, it doesn't at all. Because I like it's costly. I think for me the shotgun permit was $140, $90 for fingerprints, premise and carry.
It's almost as much as some shotguns cost.
Yeah. I mean,
themselves.
And it's renewed. You pay it every 3 years too. So it's like if you want to get carry, premise, rifle permit, you're basically paying like $900 every 3 years just to be able to keep your, I guess, collection or your rights.
Plus, you have to go into the police station fairly regularly,
pay time off, and
so really, it's something that's not open to people who don't have the means for.
No, no, definitely not. I think they've only recently added language assistance on the licensing side. It was please email this email if you need language assistance. Otherwise, it's pretty.
Yeah, so a lot of immigrants are shut out of it as well. Right.
And if I've seen during 2021, during the whole anti-Asian thing, there was like a bunch of consulting services in the Chinatown areas. They were like gouging people too. They were like, we will give you $1,000 you pay us $1,000 just to have us fill this out for you. Right. And I'm like, wow, this is, because it's not even guaranteed at the time too. So it's like, wow. Yeah. What a grift.
Yeah, that's awful.
Yeah.
So to lighten things up a little bit, what have you been doing with the shotgun? What your target shooting? Are you competing at all? Taking classes?
Primarily target shooting. I've taken that a shotgun class upstate at Blue Mountain Range, which is Westchester. I think it's public land, and it's a very, very fun course. I think we shot about 200 rounds of shells, which is like the most I've ever shot out of a shotgun for.
That's a lot of rounds.
Yeah, in one day too.
Especially 12 gauge.
Oh yeah, I had a pretty
sore shoulder
afterwards. But the main issue is we're purchase rationed, like so we can register one long gun every 90 days. Handguns is the same, but you got to bring it into 1VP for inspection. And I'm still waiting on my handgun permit. But
how long has that been?
I've applied at the same time. They're saying it's going to take about 23 to 24 months in total for the home possession permit.
Right delayed is a right denied is sort of an old saying.
Yeah.
But I guess it doesn't apply in New York City.
God knows how long it's going to take to carry because everyone applied after and tried to get in before the September 1st thing. Right. So my plan is obviously I want to shoot at least like once a month, but the main issue is I got to start with the new law. Until it's enjoined, I basically have to Uber to the range I'm a member at in Manhattan. Can't take the subway anymore. It used to be that you could transport it on the subway, locked and unloaded, just like in England, which is the funniest part. Now we're actually more strict in England because even London lets you transport long guns locked.
There was a pretty big overreaction in New York.
Yeah.
Of course, I don't think that law is going to survive for very long.
Oh, for sure.
Hasn't been blocked yet. So,
but yeah, well, hopefully soon because I definitely don't want to pay like $130 round trip just to go to the range every time. It will really put a damper on this hobby.
Yeah,
because it's already expensive. Like the ammo on its own. Like,
sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. boy. So what was it that got you into the Reload? You know, you're a relatively new gun owner here. How did you come across us, and why did you decide to join?
I think I think it was sort of like a combination of things. I think I remember either seeing you on a Vox podcast or on a other, like they had both someone from the Trace and from the Reload together. I forgot if that was Vox or something else.
This is Megan Kelly.
Right. Oh yeah, Megan Kelly's podcast.
But I was
Vox.
also on the Vox podcast.
Right. So it just sounded like you had a very measured take on things. Like, so one thing I find a little annoying about like I guess gun tube, as you want to call it, is there's a lot of clickbait hot takes, clickbait, or some people who clearly don't read, which is something I've noticed a lot on some of the spaces I'm on. Like people just don't read the statutes or they can't seem to read, right? As horrible as that sounds, some people.
No, it's sensationalism really sells these days. So
so measured takes. Yeah, measured takes. I then went to your site, saw some of your articles, and I'm like, this is probably the place for me, And I decided this helps throw $10 you guys' way, because it's like it's a coffee a day, barely.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. That's what we try to go for, be the more sober, serious sort of approach to this stuff. And I do think that there are not a lot of other options for that out there. We're not the only ones, I'm sure, of course. But I think we've tried to zero in on that.
Right.
And I'm glad to hear that that's what appealed to you. And we really appreciate you coming on and just talking to us a little bit, giving us some insight into, another Reload member. And we've got such a diverse group of people from all kinds of different backgrounds and motivations and areas of the country too, from New York City to, Tennessee to Virginia, DC, Pennsylvania, all over the place. It's really inspiring to me that so many people are interested in this kind of work, because, it is something that you don't find in major media very often, or frankly, in a lot of gun media either. So
it's very, like, if sometimes when you read mainstream news about these laws, it's just like, oh, they don't even read the laws either. So
no, they don't understand anything about gun ownership, it seems, for the most part in major outlets. I mean, they just don't have I think a large part of it is there's no focus on it. It's not a beat that most media outlets cover as a beat, something to be focused on. And so usually you get a lot of people writing about gun stories or gun laws who have never covered that before.
Right.
And so you get a lot of mistakes and misunderstandings.
Right.
But so that's where we try to be a little different, informed and independent, right? It's another thing we try to focus on being. So, but hey, we really appreciate you coming on and supporting the work that we do. So, if anyone listening wants to support our work as well, they can head over to reload.com and pick up a membership today. You'll get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and stories that you can't find anywhere else. You'll get this podcast a day early, and you'll get the opportunity to appear on the podcast, just like Alan here. And we love doing these segments. So if you're already a member, make sure you just reply to your Sunday exclusive newsletter for members, just letting us know that you want to come on, and we'll have you on the show. But that's it for now. We're headed out, and we'll see you guys again next week.